Greetings, everyone, particularly to our students. A personal message to all of you. I miss you, and I want you to know that I'm looking forward to returning to campus as quickly as possible. Greetings to our parents, our alumni and colleagues, as well as friends of the USC Sol Price School of Public Policy for joining us today. It is my distinct honor and pleasure to welcome two distinguished ambassadors to the USC Sol Price School of Public Policy, of course, virtually. I wish that we could be there in person. The former US ambassador to Armenia, Ambassador Evans, as well as who had a distinguished foreign service in the US Foreign Service and ended up as an ambassador to Armenia. And of course, our current Consul General in Los Angeles, a former Deputy Foreign Minister, and an ambassador of Armenia to India and other nations, including the UN, the Honorable Armen Barbutian is with us as well. Their bios, I'm not going to go through them because their bios are on your screen. The QR code will get you their bios. And I am looking for a conversation. Armen, if you can turn your video on. Thank you. Your Excellencies, welcome. And I call you both a friend. Therefore, I am going to drop the titles and I'm going to start calling you John and Armen as I do. Today, we are going to be discussing and conversing about a very serious topic. According to many news outlets, including the BBC, unfortunately, on September 27th, Azerbaijan began an offensive against the Republic of Nagorno-Karabakh, as we know it as Artsakh. While the people of Artsakh are used to these scrimmages over at least the last 26 years, this offensive, with the encouragement and help of the neighboring Turkey, has serious ramifications and historical realities that certainly our people who have risen from the ashes of genocide remember all too well. So this one makes it very, very serious. That's why I wanted to bring both of you on to talk about both the past, all the past, the present, and the future. Why I don't want us to dwell too much in the past. I think it's good for our audience to hear and get a little bit of historical perspective, starting perhaps with the early stages of the Soviet Union and the end of World War I, and the rise of what we know today to be the Azerbaijani Republic. Because if you look at maps, no such republic exists for a very, very long time, whereas the Armenian Empire and Armenia on the map has existed for several millennia. So, John, let me turn to you first. And you studied Russia at Yale, and then in your foreign service as well, served in that capacity, and certainly you're a specialist on the topic. If you could go back in history a little bit, bring us some context around how the Azerbaijani Republic kind of arises or is born. One of our friends and colleagues recently did an article, Harry Dekranian, a fellow lawyer and a good friend of ours, and it was a timeline of various events. I would like you to reflect on that if you could.
Yes, Frank. Thanks for the invitation to speak to your students and others. I have to start by saying that we're all very much aware of the terrible tragedy that's going on right now in the South Caucasus, and our hearts are full of that very sad feeling that we have. Rather than just looking at the foundation of Azerbaijan, I'd like to broaden the lens a little bit more with some general comments. For one thing, you know, we can all go back in history to the moments that serve us best. And you're absolutely right that Armenians are one of the oldest national groups still existing in the world. And there's evidence of Armenian settlement not only in what is today Turkey, but through the South Caucasus and even in Iran. So there's no question about the fact that Armenians are one of the original national groups there. All the Turks, and by this I mean the various waves of Turkic peoples, came to the area at a later date, mostly as conquerors from Central Asia. And that's the big picture. You have the original settlers, or the autochthonous, as an academic person might say, the indigenous people. And then you have people who came in from Central Asia at a much later date. But getting to the point of the Soviet Union, the Bolsheviks who revolted against the Shah and brought the Soviet Union into being, managed to preserve the Russian Empire. Now, the Russian Empire was a multi-ethnic, multi-confessional, multilingual empire, and the Bolsheviks managed to preserve that empire pretty much by changing the basis for it from loyalty to the Tsar over to loyalty to an ideology of Marxism-Leninism. And they did it in a rather brutal way. We saw the Russian Empire falling apart, there were impulses on the part of a number of the nations that had been in that, as it was called, a prison house of nationalities. Several of them, including the Armenians, at that time tried to organize their own republic, their own national life. And the Armenians did that, as you know, for a short time before their attempt was snuffed out by the Bolsheviks and they were absorbed into the Soviet Union, as were the Azeris. Now, the Azeris weren't as far along at that time in their national development, I would say, but they were there and they did try to form their republic, and the Georgians as well. So the big problem facing all the nationalities of the former Soviet Union and former Russian Empire, it seems to me, is that nowhere do the lines, the administrative lines that have been drawn, completely fit the realities on the ground. It's impossible to do. There's some 52, or the number varies, nationalities, ethnic groups in the Caucasus region. And not every one of them can have a state. Some are more powerful than others. The Armenians, the Georgians, and the Azeris are the largest groups, and they, therefore, in the Soviet order of things, were given their own republics. Now, one of the exasperating things here was that a serious colony, shall we say it, not colony, that's not the right word, but an ancient settlement of Armenian speakers was left like an island surrounded by Azeri Turks, and that ended up being in the new Republic of Azerbaijan. Now, I know there's a very complex legal story about this, how Stalin, as the commissioner of nationalities, decided that Artsakh would be in Azerbaijan. And you were very good to mention Harry D. Kranian's paper. I'm not sure he wrote it, but he recently distributed it. It's by the People of R, which is a site many people may know. And that has a very good description of the legal argument, in particular, the legal argument for why Karabakh or Artsakh. And by the way, I'm going to use the word primarily Karabakh because that is the word that is used by the diplomats in trying to negotiate the the settlement that is so badly needed. It does not mean any disrespect to those who refer to it as Artsakh, using a much more ancient name. But in any case, what we've got is a situation in which, as you alluded to briefly, the Azeris are stressing the legal principle of territorial integrity, which they believe means that this Republic of Karabakh belongs to them, whereas the Armenians are stressing the other important international principle accepted by the whole world, enshrined in the United Nations Charter, that peoples have a right to self-determine. And so these two principles are basically in collision, although not necessarily in such a collision that something couldn't be worked out. But the third principle, and I'll stop after mentioning this, the third most important principle is that peaceful disputes should be solved by peaceful means. And what happened on September 27th was a gross violation of that international principle of international law. And it's continued now for a month. And it seems to me, in a sense, that when violence has broken out and that principle has been violated, we can't even really discuss in any sensible way the collision of the other two principles. And I really will stop here for a second, just to say that it seems to me that at the moment, stopping the fighting has to be the number one goal. And then people can argue about history and the legal situation and possible future settlements. Thanks.
Amen, John. And that was a very good synopsis of the history and bringing us forward. I'm going to go to Armen now, but to fill in the blanks of the legal aspect, because I'm a lawyer, as you know, by training as well. I've been very interested in this for the last 30, 35 years and advocating for genocide issues and human rights. But the charter, UN charter that you speak of in chapter 1 certainly talks about self-determination of people. And in addition to that, the referenda that occurred in Artsakh, as I call it, and I appreciate your description. I have no issue with it in the international circus known as Karabakh, certainly. But in my context, the two referenda, I think, are extremely important from a legal perspective, as it used existing Soviet law in trying to self-determine in 1987 and thereafter in 1991, when unfortunately Azerbaijan pushed back. And that brings me, Armen, perhaps to you to talk about the pogroms that occurred as a result when Azerbaijan pushed back on the issue of self-determination that most people kind of gloss over. And then I'm going to come back to ask you specifically on the UN issue, because you are intimately familiar with the resolution or the topic, that territorial issue that Azerbaijan keeps bringing up. But first, the pushback that we saw in Baku and Sumgait, if you can talk a little bit about that.
Thank you, Frank. Also, let me just very briefly touch upon the historical background before that. Just a few key points that I would like to bring to the attention of the participants. Artsakh is one of the regions of Armenia. In the 5th century AD, we have a very famous Ashkharatsuits collection of maps. And according to Ashkharatsuits, Artsakh is the 10th region of Armenia. And the first reference to Artsakh goes back to the period of Urartu, Kingdom of Van, where it is mentioned as Ardakh. So, and there are several other versions. So, for example, hypothesis, not only referring to these cuneiform scripts, but also British historian David Marshall Lang, for example, came up with another hypothesis that the Artsakh word maybe derives from Artaxerxes, the king Artaxiad dynasty, when he started to rule in 189 BC, etc., etc. So, but the most important point that I want to make, that it was an integral part, as John rightfully mentioned, of the Armenian nation and the Armenian state structures that emerged since the BC period, and Urartu that existed from the 9th century to the 6th century, and the following Armenian kingdoms, and when in the periods when Armenia was conquered along with Artsakh by other invading empires, etc., etc. But one point, which is another key point that I'd like to bring to your attention, that Artsakh was not only geographically part of Armenia and structurally part of Armenia, but culturally it was one of the most important centers of Armenia proper, of Medzhaik, as we are calling Great Armenia. As far as historically there was Medzhaik, Pokadhaik, smaller Armenia, Little Armenia. And then when Armenian alphabet was invented in 406 by Mesrop Mashdod, the first school in the post-invention period was established in Artsakh, in Amaras. It was 410 AD. This is also a testimony to the fact how important Artsakh was for the entire Armenian nation. And another fact that I'm sure sheds further light on the historical background is that Artsakh, since 821 AD, was semi-independent, with different principalities existing even after Arab conquest, after Turkic invasions of 11th to 14th centuries, etc., etc. Until the 19th century, it was semi-independent. And there were different state structures existing, which were principalities, and the most important was Khachen Principality among them, and history registered the existence of 5 principalities. But at some point, from the year 1000, it turned to a kingdom. And there was a kingdom that existed for several hundred years. It was one of the last Eastern Christian Armenian kingdoms. And also, since the 13th century, Gandzasar became a seat for Armenian Catholicos. And Hasan Jalalian family that ruled Khachen kingdom. Later on, the descendants of those of the family became Catholicos of Artsakh. Coming to the period that you mentioned, Frank, so pogroms, etc. So I would like to reiterate the fact that Armenians were trying to resolve this matter even during the Soviet period. The history registered several very important steps, petitions, even at the end of the World War II, 1945, 65, 77, etc. And then in 1987, when another petition was sent to Moscow for unification with Armenia. So the interesting part that everything was being done in conformity, in line with existing Soviet legislation, Soviet constitution. And the interesting part is not only Karabakh, but I want to also to jump to Armenia's state formation process, proclamation process, and to tell that Armenia itself, the present Republic of Armenia, was doing everything according to legally according to the Soviet constitution. Even compared to other former Soviet constituent republics, Armenia waited for 6 months, as was envisaged by the Soviet constitution, and only after that proclaimed its independence in 1991, September. So the same Karabakh was doing petition, and then the Soviet structure of Nagorno-Karabakh, which was an autonomous republic, autonomous region, not republic, autonomous region within the Azerbaijani Soviet Socialist Republic. Then they proclaimed, not proclaimed, they appealed to both Soviet structure in Armenia and Azerbaijan with their firm desire and firm decision, approved by a vote of the majority of participants, and the majority was required 2/3 for this vote of the Soviets of their autonomous region to join or to unify with Armenia. As a result of this, we can see the history registered, the first move that originated from the Azerbaijani side, from Aghdam, one of the regions in the eastern part of Nagorno-Karabakh, that Aghdam population moved. Actually, it was like chaotic movement that people moved to Askiran, the neighboring Armenian populated area in Nagorno-Karabakh, and clashes happened. That was the first attack. And that attack was followed by very many attacks. And on February 27th in Sumgait, Armenians faced pogroms. As it is well known, Armenians lived all over Azerbaijan, and there was Armenian diaspora in Azerbaijan, even in Baku, in capital Baku, for about 200,000 Armenians used to live. And then pogroms started in Sumgait, which is to the north from Baku. Very many Armenians were raped, killed, and later on in Baku, in the capital in 1990, and Soviets sent troops to try to control the situation, but they were late. But the point is that immediately Armenians who faced the genocide in 1915 and this victim psychology or immediately the memories, not only the memories of the past, but the present dangers immediately appeared. And the Armenian population, not only in Azerbaijan, but all over Artsakh and Armenia, they immediately perceived these pogroms and attacks as revival of genocide and the new threat of genocide. And let me tell you also that Nagorno-Karabakh, Artsakh itself is what it represents. So it is physically, geographically, it is the eastern side of the mountainous watershed, which defines not only the Armenian plateau geographically, but also the present day, the Republic of Armenia. So I am giving this piece of information for the purpose of comprehending in overall terms the strategic importance of Artsakh, of Nagorno-Karabakh. And also let me tell you that for centuries it was a borderline between Armenians and Iranian-speaking and later on Turkic-speaking people. So when we take a look at the events of 80s and 90s, we can and also we should comprehend the importance of this region, which was always immediately from the establishment, as John mentioned, establishment of Armenian and Azerbaijani republics in 1918. It became a disputed territory, and Azerbaijan was trying to conquer this Armenian populated region. But at the same time, we should know that Nagorno-Karabakh was not part of Azerbaijan in 1918, 1920. It was legally never part of independent Azerbaijan. And if we take a look at the later period, when Azerbaijani Republic was established in 1991, so again, Nagorno-Karabakh was not part of independent Azerbaijan. So Nagorno-Karabakh was part of Soviet statehood. It was part of a Soviet system, but not independent Azerbaijan. And another interesting fact that I want to bring to your attention, that the Soviets for almost 1 year tried to introduce a direct rule, direct governance in Nagorno-Karabakh, which happened in January 1989. And this direct rule existed until November 1990. And the point is that it was ruled from Moscow, but Moscow sent a special representative, Arkady Volsky, to Stepanakert. And through this means, Moscow, and let's confirm the fact that at that time, 1989, 1990, still there was Soviet Union, and Moscow tried to rule directly, trying to find a solution for this kind of not defining the status of the Nagorno-Karabakh region, but trying to introduce this direct rule. But that also failed. And so we faced a situation when hostilities started. And my last point in this context, there is a lot of false information being circulated by Azerbaijani side, starting from the history. Just briefly, let me mention Christian Albania, starting with Christian Albania, that they are trying to claim Azerbaijanis that the present day historical monuments in Nagorno-Karabakh, including Armenian churches with Armenian scribes, those were Albanian, not Armenian. And the whole theory was invented in 1960s by Azerbaijani historian Ziya Bunyatov. And afterwards, we see also a policy, very clearly defined policy of destroying Armenian cultural heritage. And the culmination of this policy was destroying Armenian cemetery in Julfa. Julfa, or Juga, is an old Armenian town presently located in Azerbaijan, in Nakhichevan. In 2006, from the Iranian side, several persons were able to make a film, to shoot a film, showing how Azerbaijani soldiers are destroying Armenian crossstones with hundreds of years history, and they just bulldozed that and so leveled that. And this policy continued at very many other periods. And the interesting part again is that they are trying to invent constantly their version of the history, very often blaming Armenians, that Armenians started. The same we see when the aggression started on September 27th, the present day aggression against Artsakh, that there was the same pattern, same story, that Armenians attacked, Armenians invaded, and then they are protecting themselves. So this.
Let me forgive me for, let me stop you there, and I'm going to come back to you, especially on the topic of territorial issue. But I'm going to go to John now, because you brought up the genocide, and I brought up earlier the importance of Turkey, the role of Turkey that I am convinced that if it were not for Turkey, that Azerbaijan would not be doing what they're doing today. That's my conviction, or at least get the weaponry or the confidence that they have. John has, I've known him a long time, has had a very principled position on the genocide, has even written Truth Held Hostage, a book years ago. John, talk a little bit about, now that we came to the present time, because let's see if we can talk about present and potentially the future. How do you see the role of Turkey here? And how does what I said initially, that to people like me, it reminds us of genocidal tendencies when we see the aggression that we're seeing? How do you see Turkey in this?
Frank, I first of all, I want to thank Armin for that roundup of so many important facts about the history. But you're right; it's very hard to not to get to the present very quickly. And I do think that Turkey has encouraged Azerbaijan to resume the war, because the war, there was a ceasefire, but there was never really a peace. Without Turkey's encouragement, without even Turkish instructors, there was a big military maneuver in late summer in Azerbaijan in which Turkish forces took part. And apparently they took some F-16s over to Azerbaijan, which are still there. Those are airplanes that the Azeris probably haven't been trained to fly on. And it's very likely that there are some Turkish pilots over there as well. And certainly we know that Turkish munitions, in particular, very modern drones, have turned up in the Azerbaijani inventory that were never there before. And I might just throw in that there are also some very high-tech Israeli drones that have shown up and have maybe never even been used in combat before. So these factors have, I believe, emboldened the Azerbaijanis to take this fateful step of declaring an all-out military campaign against Nagorno-Karabakh and its protector, which is the Republic of Armenia. I think there were other factors that led to the breakout. I think it looked like a good moment to get away with some mischief because the United States is wrapped up in its election campaign and various other distractions. Moscow is concerned also about Belarus at this point. And for that matter, the whole world is concerned about the coronavirus. So for these and other reasons, and Europe also has many distractions, it looked like a good time to get away with something, something which they know is wrong, and they know is actually criminal in terms of targeting civilians. But Turkey, back to your original point, I do think that Turkey was the catalyst here. And indeed, we only need to look at President Erdogan's speeches to see that he's talked about continuing our grandfather's work in the Caucasus. And unfortunately, maybe not his own grandfather, but many grandfathers of Turks were involved in the original genocide, 1915, and continuing on at least until 1923. And it was not, I might just mention for some of your students that genocide was really a genocide of Christians. Now, the most numerous group were the Armenians, but there were also the Assyrian Christians. There were the Greek Christians who had lived in Anatolia for centuries in ancient times. And there were other Christian groups, and there were even some Jews who were targeted in that eruption of Islamic violence and state violence. So yes, there is a tie, and some some people poo-poo the Armenians as being paranoid, and I would just say that people who have paranoia often have very real enemies.
Indeed, and this is this part of the story that actually is bringing all Armenians in the diaspora and elsewhere up, frankly, because I am a grandchild of a survivor, and I've heard my grandmother speak about the march into the desert, and I'm a great-grandson of a victim of that genocide that you speak of. So it's very real for people like us. So when we hear this kind of aggression and ethnic-related aggression, we really stand up. And when we say never again, it means something to us, and that's why I love events like this where we're able to educate people that these are not slogans; these are truly call to action. Armin, I'm going to come back to you because I'm seeing in our questions, and they're legitimate, the issue of the UN General Assembly and the issue of the resolution declaring that Armenia should leave this area, or that this is Azeri territory, etc., etc. You were an ambassador and you served at the UN as well. And I'd like you to reflect on that because there is also some misinformation about that topic as well. So if you could reflect on that just a little bit, Armin.
Sure. I'll present those 4 UN Security Council resolutions, but in the meantime, also let me start with the territorial integrity matter of Azerbaijan, and then against this background to present the resolutions. As I mentioned, Nagorno-Karabakh was never part of independent Azerbaijan, not in the beginning of the 20th century, not at the end of the 20th century. So when Azerbaijan became a member of the United Nations in 1992, as Armenia and Georgia did in that period, so the United Nations recognizes the country, admits the country with its present borders, meaning the borders of that time period when they joined the United Nations. So, and what situation we had in 1992? We had a situation when the war already started, which lasted from 1992 to 1994. There was a war, and people of Artsakh, of Nagorno-Karabakh, were demanding their implementation or realization of their right to self-determination. As John mentioned, one of the 3 principal, 3 fundamental principles of the international law. And at the same time, in 1992, OSCE, at that time CSCE, and presently it's called Organization of Security and Cooperation in Europe, OSCE took the task of dealing, meaning mediating Nagorno-Karabakh conflict and trying to bring the parties to the conflict to the common table and find a settlement. And afterwards, in 1994, the architecture changed a little bit with the emergence of co-chairs, Minsk group co-chairs. And at that time, the whole approach was that when the settlement is going to be achieved of Nagorno-Karabakh conflict, a Minsk conference will be convened, and the Minsk conference has the mandate to define the final status of Nagorno-Karabakh. So, by membership of Azerbaijan at the United Nations, the UN and the entire international community accepted, admitted to the UN Azerbaijan with its borders, which it inherited from the Soviet period, without going, because this is the system, without going in all its details, etc. But the international community represented by OSCE and three co-chairs, namely US, Russia, and France, that continued mediation until the present period. So they developed a format for deciding the final status of Nagorno-Karabakh, thus accepting that there is a need to do that based on the final settlement. So in 1993, all three UN Security Council resolutions were adopted in 1993. And basically those Security Council resolutions present the foundation and the legal basis of the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict. And later on, there were adopted other in 2008 UN General Assembly resolution, etc. But the UN Security Council has the power and importance to shape this foundation. And very often the Azerbaijani side refers, and we know that internationally also it is the case, they refer to the fact that UN Security Council resolutions, starting from the first one, 822, adopted on April 30th, 1993, and others, 853, 874, and 884. So they all refer to the territorial integrity of Azerbaijan. And territorial integrity and sovereignty is based on the approach that I already explained. But there is also a very important point there. I want to elaborate on that and also present a few other key points. In the preamble of the resolution, it says, noting with alarm the escalation in armed hostilities and in particular the latest invasion of the Kalbajar district of the Republic of Azerbaijan by local Armenian forces. So the UN Security Council Resolution 822 refers to Armenian forces, local Armenian forces or ethnic Armenian forces. That means that the Security Council recognizes the existence of Armenian forces, their actions, military actions, and I'll explain why they invaded Kelbajar and other regions. So, but it is somehow a recognition of this fact, a very, very important fact. And when sometimes we hear that Armenia is the aggressor, etc., it is not absolutely true, because all these Security Council resolutions refer to local Armenian forces, and even Armenia, they appeal to Armenia to use its influence on Nagorno-Karabakh to achieve peace. So why local Armenian forces? They took control of Kelbajar and other regions, and eventually 7 regions that they were part of Azerbaijani regions, which surround Nagorno-Karabakh. When I say Nagorno-Karabakh, naturally it's not historical Nagorno-Karabakh. That's Nagorno-Karabakh with its borders of autonomous region. When it joined when formally in 1923, it was made part of the Azerbaijani Soviet Socialist Republic as an autonomous region. So I refer to those borders.
So what you're talking about, Armen, it's the UN resolution that everybody's referring to is really about unfinished business, so to speak, to make it simple, right? Which kind of throws it to the Minsk group, which kind of maybe leads me into my next question that I'll turn to John about. The Minsk group certainly attempted to mediate. I mean, in all fairness, everybody says, well, it's taking so long, et cetera, et cetera. There is a problem there, as I wrote a book on negotiation, and you don't negotiate this way because it sounds like, the important pieces of the negotiation puzzle are not there. So in the Minsk group, John, you have Russia, France, and what's the next country?
United States.
United States. So talk a little bit about the Minsk Group and where do you see the deficiency, if anything at all? Because in all fairness, people comment that, hey, how come there is no resolution?
One has to go back, and for the benefit of some of your students who may not be totally familiar with the OSCE, Armen gave it its full name, the Organization for Cooperation and Security in Europe. It is an organization of states. It started out at 35 states, and then as more states began appearing on the European landscape, it has expanded. I think there are now 56, considering that Yugoslavia broke down into smaller countries and Czechoslovakia and so on, and the Soviet Union. The OSCE is considered a regional organization blessed by the United Nations. So when there is a problem in the area covered by the OSCE, the United Nations naturally looks to that organization, which is headquartered in Vienna, as the proper venue for solving these problems. And the OSCE has been active in many countries. I headed an OSCE mission to Moldova at one point, where there's also a problem between the central government and some others who don't want to be ruled by that capital. And to define the Minsk Group, it sounds like some kind of mysterious group. Minsk is the capital of Belarus, very much in the news these days. But Minsk was chosen as the place for an eventual conference to deal with the problem in the South Caucasus. And there were originally 13 countries. I think I could name them, but I won't try. 13 countries out of the 35, which comprised the Minsk Group, one of them being Turkey. Of course, France and Russia and the United States, but also Armenia and Azerbaijan, and Italy and Sweden and so on. But it was too cumbersome to get this conference together, and the stresses of the situation were such that it was decided that there would be co-chairs of the Minsk Group. In the very early days, Russia was the main player in trying to stop the fighting. And indeed, it was under Russian auspices that in May of 1994, a ceasefire was reached between the parties, and very importantly, including the authorities, the de facto authorities in Karabakh. They were part of that ceasefire. Then, as everybody was exhausted from the war, and the meetings started between the two sides, Baku and Yerevan, Azerbaijan and Armenia, but not including the people who had fought in the beginning, that is, the inhabitants of Karabakh. Instead, Armenia mostly led those negotiations, in particular after Robert Kocharian became the president of the Republic of Armenia, because he was from Karabakh. And so he knew all the ins and outs of the situation there. Now, it's very simple to say that the process has failed. And in a certain sense, it has, because it has not produced a settlement agreeable to both sides. They have come very close on a number of occasions. But let's remember that it is not the mediator's job to force a solution on the two parties. Mediators instead are empowered to assist the two sides in thinking about the problem and in weighing the possibilities. But the two sides ultimately have to agree. It's not the fault of the mediators. It's very easy to blame the mediators, and both sides have done so at various times repeatedly. But what you've got in the Minsk group with the 3 co-chairs, you've got 3 of the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council, very important countries, France, Russia, United States, trying to assist these 2 relatively small countries in solving a very difficult problem. Now, I'm glad to note that tomorrow in Geneva, these talks are supposed to resume. Now, there have been, for each of these 3 ceasefires, there have been direct contacts between the foreign ministers of Azerbaijan and Armenia. But we see that one after the other, these ceasefires have been violated. And I have to say, with all the objectivity that I can muster, I believe the guilty party has been Azerbaijan in each of those cases, because I believe that Azerbaijan started the war and wants to pursue the war, whereas Armenia is very intent on stopping it and getting back to the negotiating track. Now, there's no prediction as to whether tomorrow's talks in Geneva will bear fruit, or even whether, for example, the Azeri foreign minister will actually show up. And if they don't, that's a very bad sign. If the 2 ministers do show up, and the 3 co-chairs will be there at a high level as well, maybe they can get the war to stop, or at least the shooting to stop, and get this back into a diplomatic track, which is where it belongs.
I agree, John. And I'm also fielding questions, by the way. I'm going to remind the audience, if you have any questions, please feel free to put it in the Q&A section. I am looking at them. I've already asked several that were asked, and I will continue to do so with the time left to us. But before I come back to you, Armen, maybe this kind of brings us from the present to the future. And I have been of the view, and I've written on this and continue to, and I would love to hear your comments and criticism of what I have been writing about, which is I cannot fathom, or I cannot envision a permanent solution, a long-term solution, without involving the Republic of Nagorno-Karabakh. No offense to Armenia, no offense to Azerbaijan. They are not living directly what Nagorno-Karabakh is actually, or Artsakh is living. And unfortunately, right now, living hell, especially in Stepanakert, Sushi, and other civilian locations where kindergarteners are in bunkers, trying to learn in a worldwide pandemic. So I'd love to hear your comments on Artsakh's joining this table in light of especially its own number of attempts to self-determination and the sophistication level that Artsakh has achieved in its republic. I know many of their ministers, some women, highly educated, and well-governed, I must say. So I don't know why they are not involved, and I don't understand. And frankly, I don't know how you can solve this problem. And I'm going to give a specific example. In Europe, when Kosovo had a similar predicament, if you will, of independence and involvement, Kosovo got engaged, and Kosovo gained its so-called autonomy, and then lasting peace came to the region. So that's kind of my 2 cents, and I'd love to hear. Let me start with Armen and then go back to John.
Talk about this, but very quickly, I want to tell that why all the negotiations through mediation of co-chairs, OSCE co-chairs that we're talking, didn't produce results. I want to compliment all those points that John made. And just to tell that in my personal opinion, when Azerbaijan today blames OSCE co-chairs, US, Russia, and France, telling that they were not able to produce any result, so the alternative is war. To use force against Artsakh, which is prohibited, banned by the international law. We talk about non-use of force and or threat of the use of force, which is one of the fundamental principles. So it is prohibited. So, but the point is that very often, and this is the case, even though the sides were very close to the resolution, it was not the fault of co-chairs. They did a great job. It was the fault of the parties to the conflict that they were not able to come to an agreement. And Azerbaijan itself was derailing this process for several times, as John mentioned rightfully. We're very close to the resolution, to the final agreement. But Azerbaijan was derailing the process. And eventually, they told that as far as no results, they can resort to the use of force, which is unacceptable. And they launched this war. But quickly, I want to refer to the international law. So international law, so in present circumstances, Frank, you mentioned Kosovo. So there are very many models and precedents in history. So how does it work when we have the clashing two principles of territorial integrity and self-determination? Is there a legal solution from this? Nagorno-Karabakh itself proclaimed its independence in December 1991 through referendum, legally conducted, voted referendum. But the international community, no any country in the world officially recognized. In the US, several states recognized, including California, but not on the federal level, and not even Armenia recognized. And we'll talk about this why and what is the perspective. But referring to international law, so self-determination from the very beginning of the 20th century or 20s of 20th century was perceived as a decolonization process, decolonization, not specifically suited for the present situation. Decolonization, and we know that the culmination of this was the post-World War II period where majority of colonists gained independence. And afterwards, there were very many attempts legally to spread self-determination to the issue similar to Nagorno-Karabakh. So, but normally when the conflict was over, it was settled by bilateral recognitions followed by multilateral. We have the case of Ethiopia and Eritrea when Eritrea became independent. We have cases of Timor-Leste when it was 2002 recognized by Indonesia and international community, etc., etc. Now, we have South Sudan case, which was recognized in a similar way. But we should know that in 2005, there was a new process launched at the United Nations. So at the World Summit, UN Summit, which took place in 2005, the principle of responsibility to protect was, or R2P, was introduced. And along several principles that it is defends and presents, the most important in our case, relevant to the situation, is that when there is a threat of genocide, of war crimes, crimes against humanity, and also ethnic cleansing. So then the international community can consider humanitarian intervention, and not only humanitarian intervention, but there are different forms. I'll try to put it in a very brief way. So, but also eventually the idea of remedial secession emerged. Remedial secession went to protect local population when the government does not willing, or is not capable to protect its own population from genocide, from war crimes, etc., that I mentioned, then international community should intervene or consider remedial secession. Artsakh, Nagorno-Karabakh is already independent, though not recognized. So we can talk about remedial secession, remedial recognition of Artsakh. And the point is that we have several and most important case of application, which is Kosovo. As you mentioned, Frank, Kosovo, basically it is a remedial secession, even though Kosovo is not a member of the United Nations, but recognized by very many countries, including the United States and the European Union. And we know that R2P also was applied in several other cases, like Libya 2011, etc. But remedial secession, remedial recognition is a legal response to the topic that we are discussing.
John, let me get back to you. What about what I said about to get lasting peace? You need the folks who are directly afflicted by this, and that's of course the Republic of Nagorno-Karabakh, as well as to get lasting peace, you're going to need to have this remedial secession that Armen is legally speaking about, which is what I advocated and gave the Kosovo example, although Armen correctly brings out Sudan and Timor-Leste, etc. There's a bunch of examples. What about that?
Well, before we get to that, going back to your original point, which was about why the Minsk group does not include representatives of Karabakh. I mean, it's a very simple reason, and that is that the Azeris have said no. They have tried to portray the conflict as one in which Armenia, the Republic of Armenia, has invaded Azerbaijan, and therefore the so-called occupiers ought to leave and everything would be fine. But anyone who has looked into the situation, including President Putin, who the other day, it was actually on his birthday, was interviewed by Russian TV, and he said, we all know that this began as an ethnic conflict. It was not an invasion by Armenia of Azerbaijan. It was an internal problem there between, as you said, a community that had declared it wanted to go its own way, and the erstwhile capital, which didn't want to lose possession of that area. So I have indeed, in fact, in Stepanakert in 2016, after the short April War, I believed that the time had come for Karabakh to be seated at the table of negotiations. And that is now a position which has been enunciated also by Yerevan. And in particular, the new prime minister, Mr. Pashinyan, is not a native of Karabakh. And as he has said, he was not elected by the people of Karabakh, and he doesn't feel that he should lead the negotiations on their behalf. And this is a very logical position with an eye to the question of legitimacy. Who has the right to negotiate for the population in Karabakh? They do have people, they have a small diplomatic service. They have a very capable foreign minister. They should be involved in this. You can't negotiate about a people's fate without their being there. They have to be in on the takeoff if they're going to be in on the landing. Another way to put it is, if it's about us, not without us. So that ought to happen, and there should be a way to do it, even if it's by some diplomatic trick, such as including the Karabakh diplomats in the delegation of Armenia. That could be done. There are ways to bring them to the table, and actually, I think it might help the negotiations, because the people in Karabakh know the Azeris very well, sometimes personally, and they know how good it would be if their republic could get along with the rest of Azerbaijan. There are some economic advantages for both sides. So I think it would certainly be a good thing to have Karabakh at the table.
Agreed. You've so eloquently said it, John. And as you have seen in my outreach as well, social media and otherwise, I just wrote another piece that hasn't been published yet. But I am a firm believer that if you want lasting peace, you're going to have to involve Nagorno-Karabakh Republic. There is no other way. I mean, I just cannot see any other way. And I don't, other than the emotional reaction that we're getting from Azerbaijan and the reaction of, Armen used the word derailing these processes that we're getting from Azerbaijan, frankly, it is not credible. It simply is not credible to derail and then constantly claim that it's Armenia's fault or it's the Armenians' fault. This is not just Armenia. We're not talking about the nation of Armenia, as Pashinyan correctly says. He's not elected by them. I mean, I'm an elected as well. Only people in my city elect me. I'm not elected by some other city. It's like me getting engaged in a negotiation of the city of Torrance, a neighboring city of mine, without being elected by the people of Torrance. This is silly. And unfortunately, this disinformation goes out. And that brings me to our next question. We have about 15 more minutes left. The question is, how do we, in fact, Armen, deal with the misinformation or the disinformation that we're getting in various media sources about the conflict, and more importantly, about the crises, and the constant barrage of bombardment of emotional responses without any cogent understanding of the real crisis? What can we do? What could our students do? What could our parents do, or anybody else who's listening to us do in order to engage in this, to make some sense out of it?
Sure. Thank you for this wonderful question. So from the eruption of this aggression, conflict, invasion on September 27th, so we face misinformation along with truth that is being proposed. So, and it's difficult for very many people to figure out what is truth and what is false, what is lie. And the interesting part is that it's a very evolving situation. We see that it's evolving, and even some media outlets that we were considering to be biased, they started to present and to cover events in a different way. And when we say biased, what I mean, first of all, when you have a situation where from one side you have an aggressor or aggressors, it's not only Azerbaijan, but Turkey directly participates in this aggression. And on the other side, you have Artsakh, with its security guarantor Armenia, which is a victim of this aggression. And the events are presented in a way that both sides are involved, so calls upon both sides to show restraint, to stop hostilities, etc., and not naming the aggressor. It's not just my personal opinion, but it's I believe everyone would agree with that point, that it's not fair, and it distorts the reality, distorts the truth. And starting from this point and going to all others, what would be the most important thing for all of us to see, to understand? Azerbaijan claims that Armenia is attacked and the war started this way, September war. And the point is not like who said, this side said, the other side said. The most important point is to come up with facts and realities that prove what happened. I'll give an example. Armenian side says that Azerbaijan shells the civilian areas using cluster bombs, which are, you all know, banned by international humanitarian law. And Azerbaijan says that Armenians shell and use cluster bombs. And basically, cluster bombs are used not only against Stepanakert capital, but Martuni and all other cities and villages, and even villages. So how to figure out who is right, who is wrong? It's very easy, because two very reputable organizations, one British, another US, confirmed the fact. One is Amnesty International, and another one is Human Rights Watch, US. Amnesty is London-based, Human Rights Watch, New York-based. They confirmed that cluster bombs were used against Armenians. And they confirmed, their representatives on the ground confirmed that they were used. And as far as Azerbaijan is concerned, they publicly stated that Azerbaijan doesn't provide access to them to visit the sites and to give their expert opinion. Now that makes the picture very much clear. And if we try to approach all these realities presented as fact in this critical way, to try to bring the facts that reinforce the truth, that will change the entire picture. And it is well known that Azerbaijan, from the very beginning of negotiations, was refusing to establish any verification mechanism. And I would say that the United States, as co-chair, did a lot to trying to introduce this mechanism to have in place, because any violation of ceasefire, any attempt to do that will be registered, and Azerbaijan was refusing. I think we should have this approach towards the whole story, and the realities will come to the first surface.
So basically listen to major nonpartisan organizations, Human Rights Watch and others, for example, to clarify or look at the lay of the land and confirm some of these stories. By the way, interesting you brought up the shelling in civilian areas. The picture that we used for this invitation is the cathedral in Shushi, which was hit, which was shelled. It's beyond me how any military force can shoot at a house of worship, no matter what that house of worship is, which constitutes a war crime, is amazing. But that cathedral is a gorgeous cathedral sitting on top of that hill. And we use that picture because a dear friend of mine, who happens to be a lawyer as well, Armen took that picture, not you, Armen, another Armen, Margarian actually took that picture. And I said, may I use it? Because it's absolutely a beautiful picture of what it used to be. It no longer looks that way, although we'll rebuild it. We've been always great at rebuilding stuff, but still, that's the case. All right, with the few minutes left to us, John, let me come back to you. If you had a crystal ball at this point, as a very experienced foreign service officer, what do you see at this point the world doing, including perhaps the United States and other nations, in looking at the current crises and in an attempt perhaps to avoid another genocide in the Caucasus?
I think it's very hard to, no one has a crystal ball, and it's very hard to look into the future. We're really just able to look into the next day or two at this point. And I mentioned this meeting in Geneva, and I do hope that there will be, finally, there will be a ceasefire that will hold. That's the first order of business, to stop this awful killing. Let people bury their dead. I think we are going to find, sadly, that the casualty numbers are even higher than we know, probably on both sides. Azerbaijan has not released casualty figures. And I feel compelled to mention something that we haven't mentioned yet, and that is that Turkey appears to have brought in from the Syrian battlefield hardened jihadi fighters to assist the Azerbaijanis in their struggle against Karabakh. And this is another case where it's important to confirm the facts. But as time goes on, we're getting more and more confirmation that this is true, that these people have been brought in, were probably brought in even before September 27th. And that there's also a very strong indication that they are being sent to the very front lines and are dying in large numbers, thus reducing the numbers for the Azeris themselves, which of course is politically advantageous to Baku. But on the question of the competing narratives and so on, wars always produce this kind of a situation. The first victim in war is truth. And each side will put out its version of what has happened, its claims as to what its victories have been. But as the media get better at sifting through this mass of information, as they send reporters to the war zone, as the Los Angeles Times finally did last week, sent 2 reporters, we are getting a clearer picture. And we have a much clearer picture in 2020 of what's going on than anybody did back in 1992, 3, and 4, when there was no Twitter and no cell phones with cameras and so on. So we are better informed in some ways. You know, negotiations by their nature take place not only at the table itself, but in the world, in the court of world public opinion. And the same is true of wars. They take place on the ground very tragically, but they also take place in the media. And so it's not a surprise that this has happened. The best strategy is never to tell a lie and to develop a reputation for telling the truth and being accurate and checking sources and not misleading people. And I must hand it to, in particular, one man in Karabakh, Artak Beglarian, who is the human rights ombudsman there. Tragically, he's a blind man from the time when, as a boy, he was hit by shrapnel in the last war. But he has been very good at and consistent and in giving truthful information. And it's people like that who can make a difference.
Indeed, John. And I think that I must give kudos as well. And that's why I say it's an amazing government and a setup. Araik Harutyunyan, for example, the president of Artsakh, has been an amazing leader. I teach leadership, and I'm going to take some of his videos that actually he came in front of cameras and started talking truth to his own people as well as to the rest of the world. I mean, statements that perhaps in war that one side versus the other cannot say. I mean, he clearly said, look, my claim is, or I don't have an issue with the Azeri people. Unfortunately, they're trapped just as well. And I say the same thing about the Turkish people today. They are trapped with a authoritarian, dictatorial style leader that has imprisoned pretty much any media that there was left in Turkey. All of the accomplishments of Kemal Atatürk has been kind of negated in that country. The country is almost bankrupt. The country now has no choice because of him. He wants to distract or detract attention, has attacked Iraq, the Kurds, Syria, Libya, Nagorno-Karabakh. It's all part of the same issue. And Aliyev, unfortunately, is in the same predicament. He's a fossil fuel country that is in shambles, that is both morally and economically bankrupt. So this is expedient. I'd like the world to understand that these two leaders are doing this because it is expedient for them to do it. And there is no other choice because of their internal politics is actually eating themselves up. Armen, let me come back to you and perhaps we can conclude in the next minute or so. And I'm so grateful to both of you for this wonderful discussion and for enlightening both our students, our friends, our communities, and hopefully, as John said, finding peace as no one wants war. And it's really not fair that we're put in the position that we are. Armen, what can the world do? What can countries do? And for that matter, what can Armenia do at this point in time as a country that is a stakeholder, but certainly not directly, as I always advocate that Artsakh is the direct stakeholder here?
In present circumstances, when this Azerbaijan, the Turkish aggression is an existential threat for Armenians in Artsakh and Armenians in general. So we can face a situation when we are deprived of any other option than to recognize the independence of Artsakh. I'm talking about international efforts to recognize independence of Artsakh. And the United States is very important in this regard. Within different states, I see the process of recognition already started. Some states already, as I mentioned, recognized, and it would be very, very important to continue this process. And we are encouraged by statements of leadership of the Organization of American States. And this is an organization that also unites Latin American states, and the headquarters is in Washington, D.C. And the leadership was talking openly about the need for recognition of Artsakh as a remedial effort. And we all firmly believe that if negotiations, Armenia is always open for negotiations, and we spoke about the need to have Artsakh representatives at the negotiating table, which is beyond any doubt. And originally on the ceasefire agreement of 1994, there was a signature of Nagorno-Karabakh itself, along with Armenia's and Azerbaijan's signature. But with all these processes, when negotiations are not resumed because of Azerbaijani position and because of pressure of Turkey, we might face a situation when Armenia will be considering also to recognize Nagorno-Karabakh or Artsakh's independence, Republic of Artsakh's independence, because recognizing at this stage will mean that it's a desperate move, that there is no any other way to achieve a settlement or peace or durable peace through negotiations. And this is only way to protect people of Artsakh from being just exterminated. And the international community, by this move of recognizing Artsakh and its right for self-determination, will prevent loss of lives in general, but also will enable providing durable peace for not only Armenians in Artsakh, but the entire region.
On that note, Armen, we're out of time. And again, I thank you both, dear friends, for joining me today and bringing your expertise to a very serious and important topic for the benefit of our students and parents and colleagues and alumni alike. I think this is very, very important. And as John said, we can only hope that peace will prevail, the ceasefires will hold. We will not sacrifice the sons and daughters of the fighting countries with each other, no matter who they are, no matter what they believe in, because bloodshed is completely unnecessary in this context. And only through peace, as John said, and I wrote down, we will see any kind of potential resolution of this very, very long and drawn, perhaps, negotiation with ceding of Artsakh, the Nagorno-Karabakh Republic, as a stakeholder in the process. Again, thank you both. I am eternally grateful and look forward to seeing you post-COVID somewhere in person. But thank you again. I think we sign off with this. Thank you.